On the morning of June 16th, 1991, millions of people were at home spending time with their families. After all, it was Father's Day. But at the giant United Bank Tower in Denver, Colorado, 4 security guards would never see their fathers again. Philip Mankoff, 41, and William McCollum Jr., age 33, had been on duty since midnight at the bank. Todd Wilson and Scott McCarthy, both 21, had come on at 6 a.m. It was McCarthy's first day at work, and he had no idea that it would also be his last. At 9:14 a.m., a call had come in to William McCollum at the main guard station. The caller claimed to be Bank Vice President Bob Bardwell and needed to be let in. He had forgotten his pass to enter the freight elevator. This happens from time to time among staff, so it wasn't really unusual. McCollum went down to let him in, but the man that entered was not Bob Bardwell. This intruder was wearing sunglasses and a fedora hat, and what appeared to be a fake mustache. The robber forced the guard to ride down with him to the sub-basement at the lowest level of the building, where McCollum was shot 6 times, 2 times in the back and 4 times in the back of the head. He then stole McCollum's keys and electronic access pass. The guards used to be able to carry their own firearms, but now the bank's current policy forbade guards from carrying guns. The bank was huge and multi-leveled, and the intruder knew his way around. He would make his way to the control room, surprising Mankoff and McCarthy. He would force the 2 unarmed men on their knees, where he proceeded to execute both of them. Guard Wilson would hear the shots and run towards the control room. He would be shot multiple times, with the last shot to the back of the head, to finish him off. In all, 18 shots had been fired, with 17 hitting their intended target. In addition to the guards, there were 6 bank employees working that day, performing duties in the vault. Before heading towards them, the intruder took a page out of the guard's logbook, along with several keys, 10 videotapes, and a 2-way radio. He made his way to the vault where employees were processing deposits. A lot of money would come in on Sundays, and there would be roughly $2 million in the vault on that day. The robber entered and caught them completely off guard as they were counting. He forced them all on the ground, except for the bank manager David Baranko, who he forced to put his money together. He barked at him to only put straps of 20s, 50s, and 100s together, and to not put any bait money or marked bills in the bag. He made off with roughly $200,000, even though he was aware there was so much more to be taken, like 10 times more. The robber was only in the vault for approximately 8 minutes before he made his exit. Before leaving, he told everyone to stay down and to not look at him, or he would kill them. He would then leave, and the bank employees would be left physically unharmed. The murder of 4 unarmed security guards had shook the city of Denver to its very core. Police were kind of baffled as to why the 4 men were killed, since they had no weapons, but the other witnesses were left alive. And also, why did he only make out with only $200,000 when there was approximately $2 million in the vault? It is possible that he killed them because they posed the biggest threat, and also they were kind of spread out. They would be harder to contain. The robber had infiltrated the location where the tellers were, and were able to contain them pretty easily. The police were able to surmise that the killer knew his way around the bank, and it was most likely an old employee from the bank, maybe a guard. He seemed to know how to get into the vault, and knew about the man traps connected to the vault, which is where he forced his hostages to crawl in before he escaped. The city of Denver was calling for immediate justice, and basically calling for blood. Police had several suspects right off the bat, many of whom were ex-security guards from United Bank. 3 of them looked really promising. The bank was offering a $100,000 reward for information that would lead to an arrest and a conviction. One suspect looked almost perfect for this. His name was Paul Yocum, and he had worked at the United Bank for 5 years as a guard. He had left on very unfriendly terms. On Memorial Day weekend 1990, a year before the massacre, an ATM at the bank had been robbed of over $29,000. Guards were the ones who serviced the machines, and Yocum was the last known person to be in the room where the ATM was located before it was hit. In addition to that, the individual responsible was able to turn the lights out to avoid being seen by the surveillance camera. It should be noted that he only lived about 10 blocks from the bank. While at first he would proclaim his complete innocence to police, he would later make a partial confession, but then he would recant it. Ultimately, Yocum would be charged with the theft in that case, but he would end up being acquitted in a jury trial. He quit his job at the bank shortly after, and he was very bitter. Regarding the Father's Day massacre, one witness says he saw Yocum on the morning of the robbery, near the bank carrying a dark satchel. One bank teller who was familiar with Yocum's beat-up Mustang said she continuously saw it parked in the bank garage for months leading up to the crime. Another ex-coworker would describe Yocum as weird, but a real hard-ass, the kind of person who would not confront you in a physical fight, but at the same time, he fully believed Yocum was capable of carrying out a shooting against the guards. Several ex-coworkers were convinced that Paul Yocum was behind the killings. The FBI visited the 51-year-old ex-security guard at his house and found a decent-sized stockpile of guns. This would consist of two 12-gauge shotguns, a Ruger Mini 14 rifle, and bullets for a .357 and a .38 revolver. It was suspected that a .38 was used in the killings. They also found a couple speed loaders, which were made to reload quickly, and the police were already convinced that speed loaders had been used during the bank robbery. Yocum would call his lawyer, who told him not to let the authorities search his house any further without a warrant. The FBI would leave, but they would stake out the place. Not long after, Yocum would walk out of his house with a huge gym bag. It turns out he had potential evidence in the bag that he was going to get rid of. He would claim that it was at his attorney's behest. He would be arrested and a thorough search was done on his house. 11 speed loaders and 26 boxes of ammo were discovered in the bag. In the house, semi-hollow points for a .38 and .357 revolver were discovered. Although agents were hopeful, they would not match up to the projectiles that were found at the scene. Strangely, none of the revolvers in the home would be able to fire the bullets. Not all of Paul's registered guns were present in the home. Some were missing. There was no physical evidence of Yocum having committed the crime, and his photo was not identified in a lineup. But one thing that was incredibly damning was a personal diary of Paul's that was found in his car. Yocum wrote how he was dead set on revenge and would never forget how the accusation and charges against him for the ATM theft had ruined his life. Yocum wrote, "I have a character flaw. I don't forget who screwed me. I have another flaw in my character, patience. I am patient to a fault. I will get even. I have the patience to do it. I may wait 50 years, but I will get even eventually." The charge had basically ruined Yocum's life. He had to borrow so much money for his defense from his father than he could ever repay, and it would ruin their relationship. Before this happened, they were very close, and Paul would be constantly reminded of it until his father finally passed away. Yocum had a weak alibi on the day of the massacre, and more of his guns would be found at his mother's house. And the FBI really liked him for the crime at first, but because they couldn't find any physical evidence tying him and his photo was not picked out, they had to move on. Another very strong suspect was Mike McGowan, another ex-security guard of United Bank in Denver. But at the time of the robbery, he was living in Seattle. At the scene of the robbery/murders, a fingerprint had been lifted off of a Mountain Dew can that was suspected of belonging to the perpetrator. As part of the hiring process, guards would have to submit their fingerprints to the bank. But McGowan's file with his fingerprints had mysteriously turned up missing. Shortly after the bank robbery, an anonymous tip was made saying that McGowan was the one who orchestrated the robbery and the murders. He was quickly picked up by the FBI. He seemed to have a pretty solid alibi though, with family saying he was in Seattle at the time, which is where he now lived with his sister. Even though witnesses started picking his photo out of a lineup, stating he looked a lot like the guy who held them up. Ex-coworkers were interviewed, and some would claim that McGowan was psychotic. He would boast about how easy it would be to rob the bank, and that he would use booby traps and grenades during a heist. But in the end, his alibi was ironclad and he would not be charged. Another suspect that was looked at very closely was a current guard at United, 25-year-old Harry Glass. He was originally supposed to work that morning, but told to come in the afternoon instead, as guard Scott McCarthy would work in the morning. The print on the Mountain Dew can was a match for one of Harry's fingers. When confronted with this, Harry became angry. He had always said how easy it would be to rob the bank, and his claims weren't taken seriously. Harry would not admit to any wrongdoing, though. Harry would end up quitting the bank the next day. The police didn't have enough to hold him. It was also speculated that this may have been a two-man job, involving an outsider and an insider, and it was conceivable that the insider was one of the guards who was murdered. Out of these three, Paul Yocum looked the best for it, but Paul Yocum actually pointed investigators into a different direction. He told them he thought the culprit was former United Bank guard and retired police officer Jim King. Originally, King wasn't even considered a suspect, when the FBI had a list of 15 persons of interest and King wasn't even on that list. But that would soon change. King was a smart guy and he loved to play chess. The police would soon set their sights on this strategic man. And just like in the game of chess, this King would need somebody good to defend him. King would end up calling an old chess acquaintance, Walter Gerash, a lawyer who advised King to not talk to the police without a lawyer present. But King was assured by the police he wasn't a suspect, that they just wanted his help, and the ex-cop would fall for their lies. Just a brief background on this newest suspect. James King was born James Ette in San Francisco on July 10, 1936, to mother Doris Louise. The father was a sailor away at sea, and his parents divorced when he was only 3 years old. His mother would end up marrying Navy man Harold Scott King, and James would adopt his name. By all accounts, King seemed to have a good upbringing, although the family did have to move around the country quite a bit. He graduated from Castlemont High School in Oakland in 1954. King would serve in the Army for 3 years, where he was trained as a military policeman. After being honorably discharged, he would later go to college at the University of Colorado. In 1961, King would meet future wife Carol and also join the police force that year. Him and Carol would have 3 sons. During his 25 years on the force, he would sometimes moonlight as a security guard, and in 1973, he would actually stop a robbery in progress by containing and apprehending the suspect before he could use his gun. But overall, King would be described as quiet, but very professional. He would let his badge be his voice, basically. He wasn't a big fan of confrontation, and he wasn't aggressive. Jim King would go on to be charged in the robbery and the murders at the bank, and prosecutors would seek the death penalty. The public would call for his blood, and even the governor at the time would say the death penalty is necessary. And this was all long before the trial had even begun. But why did they look to Jim King as a perpetrator? It had to be some pretty strong evidence, right? Well, I'll let you be the judge. Upon the first meeting, King had spoke with detectives for less than an hour, and in the entirety of the interview, the detectives focused on a couple things they said made King look suspicious, and this would ultimately get them their warrant to search his house. King had made disparaging remarks about how the FBI and Denver police were mishandling the case. King also spoke of how the United Bank did not treat their employees well, namely the guards. The detectives took these statements as to mean that Jim was angry and bitter, and maybe wanted to get back at the bank. So I'm going to go down the line of everything the detectives had on Jim King. One of their strongest pieces of evidence was that not only was King's alibi weak, it sounded made up. King said that between 9 and 10 a.m. that day, he had gone down to the Capitol Hill Community Center to play in a chess tournament. The problem with this alibi was there hadn't been a chess tournament at the community center in about 3 years. Jim would explain he hadn't played down there in years, but he was really feeling it that day. And when he arrived, he realized that there was no games going on, so he left and went back home. However, the guy who ran the community center could not vouch for him showing up there. Regarding the bank robbery, the intruder called the guard at 9:14 a.m. right at the bank. King lived approximately 11 miles from the bank, and one neighbor claimed to see King at home at 9 a.m. This would make it nearly impossible for King to travel that far and to pull that off, if that time is accurate. Furthermore, another neighbor recalls King returning home at 10 a.m. The robber had left the bank vault at 9:56 a.m., so something is not adding up here. He wouldn't be able to travel 11 miles in 4 minutes. The day after the murders, Jim King had shaved his mustache and purchased a safety deposit box at his bank. As far as the mustache goes, Jim would sometimes shave his mustache off, and according to witnesses at the bank, the intruder was most likely wearing a fake mustache anyway. As far as the safety deposit box goes, the prosecutor would say that the size was perfect for $200,000. This information was a reach and was not able to be used at trial, especially because it didn't take into account other items that were found in the box. But there was one thing that was not found in the box, and that was the nearly $200,000 that was stolen. Shouldn't that be evidence that he didn't steal the money? They're saying that he got the deposit box to contain the stolen loot, but then decided not to use it for its intended purpose. However, what they did find in the deposit box did raise some eyebrows. They ended up finding 5 different ID cards with Jim King's picture, but with other people's names and information. This was not allowed at trial to be presented because it was never proven that King had used the IDs in any illegal way, and there was never any connection between the IDs and the case at hand. It should be noted that King did work for the ID Bureau for a time while he was a police officer. Jim King had a .38 revolver and he used speed loaders for it. That caliber gun and the speed loaders were suspected to be used in the bank heist, but Jim King had gotten rid of his .38 months prior when the firing cylinder cracked, along with the speed loaders and his police-issued service belt. The gun was defective and so he didn't have much use for it, so he would dispose of it. The prosecution tried to claim that King disposed of these after committing the crime to get rid of crucial evidence. Later on, King's son David would testify on his behalf. He said that in October of 1990, his father offered him the belt. When Dave asked if he could get a gun with it, King said that he was getting rid of the weapon because the cylinder was cracked. Dave told him he didn't want the belt if it didn't come with a gun. Also, there was a map of the bank in Jim's home that was labeled plans. Prosecutors saw this as another incriminating piece against King, but it was later revealed that it was very common for employees to be given maps of the large building. The defense would point out that there was no physical evidence against King. Fingerprints were tested at the scene that did not belong to him. Shoe prints had apparently been left in the control room where a guard was killed that must have been left by the killer, but they didn't match up with any of King's shoes. Defense attorneys Walter Gerash and Scott Robinson would point their fingers at other ex-guards at the bank, especially Paul Yocum, who would resemble a man in a fedora hat seen by a witness outside the bank just before the robbery. When the 6 bank tellers from the robbery went to go through a photo lineup, not a single one of them picked King. Later on, 5 of the 6 witnesses would pick him out of the same lineup after the FBI drew a hat and sunglasses on him. Jim King had a lot of moles on both sides of his face that were clearly noticeable. None of the witnesses had noticed any moles on the assailant's face. The assailant had a thin adhesive strip on his left cheek, but it wasn't anywhere that would have covered a mole on Jim's face. Bank manager David Baranco admitted on the stand he thought the robber's mustache was fake, and that he never described the robber as having any moles. But he said under oath that he could see King's facial moles in the courtroom from 20 feet away. It truly is a tragedy of what happened to the guards, and no doubt traumatizing what the tellers had to endure. But I honestly think that the FBI and Denver police rushed to judgment on this one, and they arrested the wrong guy. I think that witness testimony is not always the most reliable. The tellers were probably thinking the FBI had arrested the right man, and they wanted to do their part to make sure justice was served. But there was too much reasonable doubt here. Another name would come up of a man who was never an employee at the bank, but he looked pretty suspicious for the crime. His name was Dewey Calvin Baker. He had a large mole on his left cheek in the same spot the thin adhesive strip was seen on the bank robber. He usually sported a large mustache. He had served time for 4 bank robberies before he was paroled in May of 1991, just 6 weeks before this robbery. It was determined that he was in the city of Denver in the month of May, but never proven if he was in Denver the day of the heist. Baker did match the description of the assailant. Also, he matched the description of a person who attempted to rent a car at Stapleton Airport in Denver on Father's Day. Baker would brag in jail about murdering 4 guards. FBI and Denver police claimed to have known about Baker, and they said that they had cleared him. After deliberating for 53 hours over 9 days, the jury came back with a judgment of not guilty. King could finally breathe and be able to walk free. From then, he would live an isolated life. The FBI would stalk him still, even after the acquittal, but they wouldn't find him to do anything out of the ordinary or incriminating. King would die of dementia on May 21, 2013. Paul Yocum was never charged, and he would die of a heart attack 4 months after the verdict, at the age of 52.